work. Extremely important in the intellectual development of cognitive psychology and much of where we are now in artificial intelligence and all those sorts of things. Anyway, and with that, I will please help me join me in welcoming George Lakoff.
Thanks, Eric. Well, now that you've heard the talk, thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see you. Can we raise the house lights a little bit, because I would like to see who I'm talking to a bit. I don't like speaking to a dark audience. So Justin, a little bit of light out there. This is a remarkable time, and I think it's important to understand what is happening in the neurosciences and the cognitive sciences, and what isn't happening. So let me mention, for example, what happens when you see one of these so-called pictures of the brain. You've all seen these things. They have red and blue and yellow and so on. There's no red and blue and yellow in the brain. What happens is this. The pictures are not pictures of the brain. They're pictures of the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood in certain places. And when neurons fire, they need to get some oxygen back in there so they can fire again. And it turns out that they have different magnetic properties if the blood is oxygenated or not. And what you see actually is a bunch of pixels, and each little pixel is actually 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters, 3 millimeters cubed, and it goes over anywhere between 1 second and several seconds. Now, if you ask how many neurons are in there, the answer is about 125 million per pixel. Each neuron is connected to between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons, so there are tens of billions of connections, lots of circuitry in that one little pixel, and that picture doesn't show you what's going on in that circuitry. Very important. We cannot see that. We can say, hey, something is happening there. We don't know exactly what. Neural computation allows us to model what it is that's happening there and to ask a deep question. And the question is, how is it possible for neurons, which are just these things that fire and propel axons onto the next neuron, how do you get ideas out of neurons? Even if there are 100 billion of them and trillions of connections, how do you get ideas out of them? And that is what we have begun to figure out. So we're going to talk about that idea today. And it turns out it has lots of consequences, including consequences for politics, which I've been writing about for some time. But I want to talk about the science behind it today. The science behind it is actually quite remarkable because it makes a radical change. What it changes is our understanding of what it means to have reason, what it means to be a human being, and what it means to be able to reason using a brain and a body. Now, there's something shocking there. I and many of you were brought up with the idea of Enlightenment reason, critical thinking. And Enlightenment reason had a number of properties, and it turns out that most of them are not true. Enlightenment reason is useful in many situations. We'll talk about why it's useful and why it's been popular and so on. But it's inadequate, grossly inadequate for understanding what it means for human beings to understand the world and to think. So what we're going to do is talk about real reason, which is coming out of the neural and cognitive sciences, and what the properties are. So there's a certain myth that comes out of Enlightenment reason. It says, I think, therefore I am, says Descartes. Reason is conscious. You know what you think. It's just not true for most of your thought. It's unconscious, mainly, about 98%. Consciousness is the tip of the iceberg. How do you get 98%? there are two ways. One, if you look at what you're conscious of versus what your brain is doing, the role is about 50 to 1. Your brain is doing 50 times as much as you're conscious of. And there's another way to look at it. If you take a sentence and you say, what can the next sentence be in a paragraph? And what do you have to fill in to understand all the possible next sentences? The answer is that you need to fill in 50 times as much as is in that sentence, roughly. So it's about 98% unconscious. You're not even aware that you're filling this in, but you're not. Moreover, consciousness could not, in principle, be you couldn't have reason being conscious because most of your reason is done in parallel circuitry, but consciousness is linear. So you have massively parallel circuitry, but you're tracing out a linear path through it, and that means you can only be aware of a tiny portion of what you're thinking. Now, there's another myth, and that is that thought is abstract, that concepts are abstract and disembodied, as if they're sort of kind of floating in air. And that's not true. Thought is physical. It is a matter of brain circuitry. It's what the brain is doing. And that's important because how can thought be meaningful? And as we'll see, it's made meaningful via connections to the body in ways we'll talk about in a few minutes. The next view that is a shocker is that you can reason directly about anything in the world. You have this capacity for reason, and you say, well, anything in the world, whether it's in politics, in economics, in the environment, in human relations, we can reason directly about it. It's not true. Because you think with an embodied brain, reason is indirectly connected to the world. Not that it's disconnected, though it can be. You can imagine things. But you can only reason about and understand what your body and brain allow. You cannot understand just anything at all. And this, as you'll see, is crucial in politics. If you have a certain political ideology on one side or another, you may not be able to understand what other people with a different ideology are saying. You may not be able to hear a fact and make sense of it if you have a view of the world in which that fact does not fit. You can't understand just anything, and you'll get examples of that in a while. Now, ideas are made meaningful according to the old theory because they have direct connections to the external world. Somehow this abstract thought supposedly just goes directly to the world, which isn't true. What really happens is that ideas are made meaningful via the connections to our body and embodied experiences. Now, how can that work? Well, let's look at some of the ways it can work. First, before we get to that, we need to talk a bit about emotion. In the old view of Enlightenment reason, emotion got in the way of reason. Emotion was the enemy of reason. Reason was what, sort of like Mr. Spock on Star Trek, who is, super reason, no emotion, whatever. Not true. Suppose that you had a stroke or a brain injury that wouldn't allow you to feel emotion, and there are such strokes and brain injuries. What Antonio Damasio and his wife Hannah figured out some years ago and published in a book called Descartes' Error is that you can't reason without emotion. Emotion is necessary, and it's easy to see why. If you cannot feel emotion, then like and not like mean nothing to you, and you do not know what to want. Think about it. If you couldn't feel anything, if you wouldn't know what it meant to like or not like something, or if somebody else, or you couldn't tell if someone else would like or not like what you were doing, you wouldn't know what to want. You couldn't set a goal. And this is what happens to people with such brain injuries. They act randomly. They don't know how to plan. They don't know how to structure their lives or set rational goals because rationality requires emotion. Very, very deep finding. Now, the old myth was that reason uses mathematical logic, and I spent well over a decade working to try to see if mathematical logic would work for the way that we reason in natural language. It failed, and it failed hugely. And I can tell you lots of reasons why it failed and where it failed and so on. But we'll maybe go through a few of those here and there. But the big result is that reason uses logics of what are called image schemas, and I'll give you examples of this in a minute, frames, conceptual metaphors, prototypes, and narratives. Now, what are these things? Let's take a few minutes. An image schema is a brain structure that structures imagery. So, for example, we are in an auditorium. It is a container. I have here a glass of water. That's a container for the water. There are lots of containers around the world. Windows are containers. Rooms are containers. Your body is a container. How do you understand them all as containers? Now, what has been discovered by Terry Regier, who is worked in our lab on his PhD thesis back in the mid-90s, is that there is a brain structure that can compute any kind of container. No matter how big or how small, wherever it's located, whatever its shape is, there's a simple brain structure that puts together certain what are called topographic maps of the brain that will compute any container. It'll tell you what the interior is, the boundary, the exterior. Now, that is called an image schema. It structures your mental imagery. And there's lots of others. There are paths with a source, path, and a goal. So if you talk about going into something, you have a path that begins outside the container and winds up inside. No big deal, but it's interesting, as we'll see, because they're in different parts of the brain. And the question is, how do they get together? And we'll talk about that. Image schemas also structure space. So there is in front of, in back of, behind, above, below. Those are structured relative to the body. The body is represented in the brain. Up here, primary motor cortex, there is an actual map of the entire body, neuron by neuron in the body, connected to neurons up here. That map allows you to locate things in space relative to your body. That is what allows you to talk about things being in front of or behind or next to and so on, and things like that. Those are called image schemas, and then there are process schemas called aspectual schemas that tell you what a process is. Or what is the precondition? What are you starting with? What is the middle? Are you iterating it, doing it over and over? Is the process long or short? Has it met a goal? Have you reached the end? Is there a consequence of that process? Is it part of a bigger process? Those are structures that have been studied, figured out, and that are computed by neural circuitry of your brain. Every single language in the world uses the same structures. And the same elementary image schemas show up in languages all over the world because they're part of our human neural structure. So image schemas are parts of that, but also they all allow certain reasoning. If you know that a container A is inside container B, and you put something inside container A, you know it's going to be inside container B. That is, if you know you have a closet inside your house, and you put your tennis racket inside your closet, your tennis racket is inside your house. Okay? That has to do with the logic of the container schema. And we know how that logic functions, and it functions neurally. So a lot of your reasoning is coming out of those schemas. Very important to see that. Those schemas structure bigger schemas called frames. Now, frames were figured out in the mid-1970s by a number of people. But in particular, Charles Fillmore, a linguist in my department and one of the world's great linguists, figured out that every word is defined in terms of a structure like a frame, and let me tell you what a frame is. It's very simple. Imagine your understanding of a hospital. Well, there are certain roles played by people in that hospital. There are doctors and patients and receptionists and nurses. There are rooms like operating rooms, and there are instruments like scalpels and so on. And there are things you know about hospitals. You know, for example, that surgeons operate on patients in operating rooms with things like scalpels. Okay? Every frame is a structure like that. And if I say the word surgery, immediately everything about it will come up. You'll know that there's a surgeon, there's a nurse, there's a patient, there's an operation going on, etc. You know something, and a lot. What one word is defined relative to a frame. What Fillmore discovered was that every word in every language is defined relative to some frame. That is a crucial discovery. And what's really important about that, and important for politics, is that, well, consider the following. When I teach this, the first thing I do is I give my students an assignment. I say, okay, everybody ready? Don't think of an elephant. You all can do that, right? You got a problem. Because the word elephant evokes an image and knowledge, a frame in which you understand what an elephant is. And if you negate the frame, you have to activate it anyway. Right? The word activates the frame even if you negate it. And that's important for political reasons that we'll come back to in a while. But words activate frames, and frames are ways in which you structure the world. You cannot think without frames. You cannot speak without frames being there, and those frames are physical. They are circuitry in your brain that carries out all those inferences and imposes that structure. And that circuitry, once you learn a frame, is there mostly for life. You know, for many of these cases, they're just there all the time. And we'll talk about how that can happen. Another very important part of what is not in mathematical logic is metaphor. And metaphor used to be thought of as something in poetry or rhetoric and in terms of language. But what Mike Reddy and I discovered back in 1978 was that actually it's a mode of thought. That linguistic metaphors are sort of surface realizations of more complicated metaphors. The first example that I looked at was a very simple case in which there were linguistic expressions like our relationship has hit a dead-end street. The marriage is on the rocks. It's been a long, bumpy road, where love is understood as a journey. Now, there are a lot of expressions in which love is understood as a journey, like we're at a crossroads in this relationship. We're going in different directions. We may have to bail out, right? Lots of linguistic expressions, but there's a generalization here. The generalization is that in every single case, the lovers are travelers. In every single case, the relationship is a vehicle. In every single case, the lovers are supposed to have common life goals. That are understood in terms of destinations they're trying to reach. And in every case, difficulties in the relationship are understood as impediments to motion toward those common life goals. So if you say we're spinning our wheels in this relationship, what happens? You have an image of a car. The car isn't moving. The wheels are turning. You want to get it moving. You're putting energy into getting it moving, and you're frustrated. You take that and you say, okay, let's map that from journeys to love, and that says we have a love relationship, but it's not going anywhere. We want it to, go somewhere to reach our common life goals. Not happening, and we're frustrated. That is, there's a mapping from journeys to love, and that image allows your knowledge of that image to map to love and reason about love in terms of journeys. Right? How many of those metaphors are there? in your brain, tens of thousands. And then we're going to point out in a little while that they have elementary metaphors that make them up. There are actually smaller metaphors that fit together, but we'll get to that in a while. The point is, none of this is in Enlightenment reason. None of this is in logic. None of this is in what was called critical theory, when I was going to college, where the idea was to say, oh, you have to learn to reason logically about things. It turns out people think in terms of these structures that are there in your brain that are not part of Enlightenment reason. Now, there's another myth, and the myth is that Enlightenment reason is there. Reason is there to serve your interests. That's why we have it. That's the usual assumption. It's partly true. Reason can serve your interests, no question. But reason can also serve empathy and social connection as well as self-interest. And let me tell you how this was discovered. Because empathy turns out to be physical. Back in 1996 in Parma, Italy, a remarkable thing happened. In the neuroscience lab there, and I've been there, Vittorio Galeazzi was running an experiment for Professor Rizzolotti's lab, in which they had macaque monkeys, and they were training the monkeys they trained them to push buttons and peel bananas and grab rings and do certain things. And then they had probes in the monkeys' brains, neuron by neuron, in what is called the premotor cortex, which choreographs actions. It sort of puts actions together. And they were looking at which neurons fired when the monkeys did which actions. They had it hooked up to a computer, so that every time the monkey moved and did this versus peeled a banana, etc., you would see exactly which neurons were firing. The monkey grasped something, you would see which neurons are firing, and if he grasped with the right hand, it'd be one set, left hand another set, etc. And this was going just fine. Then it was lunchtime. And in Italy, you take a nice lunch. So you take a nice lunch, Vittorio comes back, didn't have dessert, there's a pile of bananas. Okay, you take a banana, he starts to peel it, and he finds that the computer is registering click, 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 that the monkey's brain, which was supposed to register monkey movements, is registering his movements. And when they checked it out, it turns out these were exactly, at least 1/3 of the neurons firing, 30% actually, were the neurons for peeling bananas. Then they did further experiments and they found out that there was an interesting phenomenon. That there's a connection between vision and action. That the same neurons that are firing when you peel a banana are firing when you see someone else peel a banana. Well, not quite all of them, 30%, the other 70% are doing interesting variations on that. But those 30% are interesting. They're called mirror neurons. They mirror what you're doing, and they link vision and action. And then they found out why. There is a neural pathway directly between the premotor cortex and the parietal cortex just behind it that integrates vision. And they are, tuned as you're growing up to link vision and action. So that vision and action are linked together. But then the other interesting thing is that mirror neurons are connected to the emotional regions. And emotionally, something wild was discovered back in the 1950s and 60s by Paul Ekman, namely that we have a physiology that corresponds to our emotions. Darwin first hypothesized this. That around the world, when people are happy, they smile. When they're sad, they frown. When they're angry, they bare their teeth, etc. And animals do a lot of the same things. And that basically there are other physiology of emotions. When you're angry, your skin temperature rises 1/2 degree, which is why you say, my blood boils. Why you get burned up, and so on. There's a reason for that. Those metaphors for anger are based on your actual physiology. And that physiology of anger is tied to the mirror neurons, because the physiology has to do with what your body is doing. And if it's connected to vision, you can see what someone else's body is doing, and you can tell if somebody is writhing in pain or deliriously happy or really sad or whatever. You are emotionally connected to other people via your brain. You have a brain, and everybody else has the capacity for what's called empathy. It's a physical capacity linking you to others, and that's how social connection works. That is a physical thing. And actually, most of reason, a huge amount, is based on social connection and empathy. It's not just self-interest. And that's important for many reasons, having to do with morality and with politics. Next, it was assumed that rational thought was value-free. It was just, about what was true in the world and so on. And it's not. Because you're concerned with empathy and morality when you're thinking, and with emotion, rational thought is really value-based. Now, let's go back one. There's a further view. Descartes assumed that all rationality was the same for everybody, that it was universal. That what made us human beings was being rational and logical, and that therefore everybody had the same mode of reasoning. Now, if that's true, then all you have to do, let's say in politics, is tell somebody the facts, and everybody will reason to the same conclusion, right? Sure. Not true. That is, if Enlightenment reason were right, that would happen. It doesn't happen. It turns out that it is not the case that all concepts are universal and that all of them are accessible to everybody. And then there's another view, a view coming out of postmodern thought that says no concepts are universal, they're all arbitrary. That's also false. Many concepts are universal and many are not. They vary, and it's an empirical question, which is which? And they vary from language to language. And that's important. You need to know that it is not the case that everything, all thought is universal, and it's not the case that it's all language particular or particular. That is, you need to know empirically what part is shared with other people who speak other languages and come from other cultures, and what part is not. And that is an important empirical study. So the big myth is this, that there is some objective, rational structure to the world out there, and that human reason can fit it directly and characterize it literally without frames or metaphors and reason about it adequately with formal logic alone. That's just false. The world is real. It is whatever it is. Our bodies and brains provide understandings of the world which depend on frames, metaphors, image schemas, prototypes, narratives, all of those things. And it is that permits us to create mathematics and to create scientific theories of the world. Mathematics is not just out there. Mathematics works by the same mechanisms. And if you're interested, there's a book called Where Mathematics Comes From, which goes through it in very, very great detail. Now, what about language? As you heard a little bit before, Chomsky came up with the view that language is purely formal and abstract, that it's just a bunch of meaningless symbols, that the grammatical structure of a language is independent of meaning and communication. And that's not true. Language is a physical product of the embodied human brain, and grammatical structure makes crucial use of meaning and communication. So let me give you some examples of how meaning works in grammar. So let's take an example like a simple sentence. The ball went to left field. Now, the to left field is what's called a directional adverb. It tells you where it's going. And in there, directional adverbs usually go along with motion. They have to do with direction of motion, and a thing that moves. And in this sentence, it happens that the thing that moves and the motion are represented in the sentence itself. The ball is moving, went has to do with going, that's motion, to left field. And so the question is the occurrence of this directional adverb, to left field, just dependent upon what's in the grammar of the sentence? Is that true? Well, now I started looking into this in 1963, God help me, a long time ago. And in 1963, there was a left fielder, a rookie left fielder for the Boston Red Sox called Carl Yastrzemski. He's now in the Hall of Fame. It's been a long time. Some of you may be old enough to remember Carl Yastrzemski, great hitter. And the sentence was, Yastrzemski doubled to left. Now, you can, if you know baseball, you know what that means. And notice that the to left, we'll talk about why it's not left field, you could say to left field. Yastrzemski doubled to left. That directional adverb does not have a ball or a verb of motion in it. Double is not a verb of motion, and it's not Yastrzemski who's going to left. If you say Yastrzemski doubled off the wall, it's not Yastrzemski bouncing off the wall, it's the ball. The word double has within its meaning the idea of the ball going somewhere, and the to left field tells you where the ball went. It depends upon the meaning of the sentence, not just the elements in the grammar of the sentence itself. That is a counterexample to the old theory that says it's all just arbitrary symbols. It has to do with meaning, and that's crucial. Let's take another example. If you're a linguist, you study things like existential versus deictic locative constructions. Let me give you an example. So, there is a God is an existential. It says God exists. And notice you can negate it. You can say, there isn't a God. Or you can question it, is there a God? Or you can say, there's a God, isn't there? Right? Normal, that's how normal sentences work. But there's another kind of sentence, like, there's Harry on the bench, over there. That's a deictic locative, it's pointing to Harry, and the there isn't existential. It doesn't say Harry exists, it's pointing out where he is. Okay? Now, you can't negate that. You can't say, there isn't Harry on the bench. Or you can say, if you say something like, here comes the bus, you can't say, here doesn't come the bus. Right? Can't negate it. You can't question it. Is there Harry on the bench? Or does here come the bus? Impossible. You can't have a tag question like, there is Harry on the bench, isn't there? Right? Impossible. Here comes the bus, doesn't here? No good. Right? Now, why? Is this just a matter of arbitrary symbols moving around, or does it have something to do with meaning? Well, think about what a deictic locative is. It points out something. What you're doing is assuming the following. You're communicating to somebody else, and you share a visual field. And what you're doing is pointing to a location in that visual field. You're trying to get the other person to look at that location, and you're saying, what's in that location? There is Harry on the bench. Here comes the bus. Okay? That's what you're doing. What would it mean to negate it? It couldn't work because it's existing in the visual field. It's there. And since it's there in front of you, it's obviously inconsistent with negation. Since it's there in front of you and you're pointing it out, it's inconsistent with questioning. If you have a tag question like, isn't he, or something like that, or isn't there, that is doubting something. But this is indubitable because it's there present for you. The meaning of the construction is telling you its grammar. The meaning of the grammatical construction is telling you what the grammatical possibilities are. And that's profound. Let me give you another example. There's a phenomenon called negative polarity items, like a red cent, and Harry doesn't have a red cent. You don't say, Harry has a red cent. Or Harry doesn't give a good goddamn about that. Not Harry gives a good goddamn about that. And so on. Now, so you don't say Harry has a red cent. Or I wouldn't do a damn thing for him, but not I would do a damn thing for him. Now, there is an interesting phenomenon where you have sentences like, why paint your house purple? Which means you shouldn't do it unless you have a good reason. Versus why not paint your house purple? Which means you should do it unless you have a good reason. Notice that the positive one, why paint your house purple, is a negative suggestion. You shouldn't do it. And the negative one, that has a negative in the sentence, why not paint your house purple, is a positive suggestion. So the question is, does the negative polarity item, like a red cent or a damn thing and things like that, does it go with the meaning or does it go with the actual element of the sentence in the grammar? Does it go with the symbols? Well, look at the sentences. Why give Harry a red cent, but you don't say, why not give Harry a red cent? Why do a damn thing for him, but you don't say, why not do a damn thing for him? That is, the negative polarity items, a damn thing and a red cent, are going with the grammatical positive, but the semantic negative. It's going with the meaning, not with the grammatical form. The meaning is determining how this grammatical element works. Meaning is determining grammar. Now, that's important because it goes along with all the other things we're saying. What is meaning? Meaning has to do with what your brain is doing. That is, grammar is going to turn out to have to do everything to do with how you understand things in the world with your brain. And that's very interesting. So let's look at some results from neuroscience and look at some of the brain basics, because at this point we want to ask, how do we make sense of all of this? How does it work? What are we doing? And what is the present state of the research on it? So here are some basics. Color is not in the world. There are no colors out there in the world. There is no green in grass. Okay? There is no blue in the sky. There is no red in the sunset or in the rose, etc. Colors are a product of several different things. There are wavelength reflectances, that is, each object reflects certain wavelengths, but individual wavelengths aren't colors. Colors are something you sense, and they go across many wavelengths. So there are wavelength reflectances. Color depends upon things in you. In your retina, there are certain color cones that respond to certain ranges of wavelengths. You have to have the color cones to see color. If you don't have all your 3 color cones, you're what is called colorblind. Next, there are neural circuitry connected to those color cones. And that neural circuitry is what computes color. Color doesn't exist without the color cones, the neural circuitry, and the reflectances in the world. It's an interaction between the world and you and through your body and brain. But the color is only in your mind, in your brain, in your understanding of the world. It isn't out there independent of you. That's wild. Now again, go back to the idea that meaning is a matter of truth in the world. And that if you think about it, a sentence like, the chair is green, in a traditional view coming out of Anglo-American philosophy, it would say that's true just in case the entity referred to in the world by the word chair is in the set of green things in the world. There is no set of green things in the world. That account of meaning cannot be true, but it's taught in most philosophy classes in the West. It's taught as the theory of meaning, but it's false. Let's continue. We saw in the mirror neuron cases that action and perception are linked, that the same neurons are firing during actions and perceptions of the same actions. That's very important because it turns out that concepts have everything to do with that. And So let's continue. As a result, that is why there are things called basic level categories. So let me tell you about basic level categories. It was discovered by Eleanor Roche back in the mid-1970s that category hierarchies like furniture, chair, and desk chair, or like vehicle, car, and sports car, had different properties. That at the middle level of car and chair, you could get mental images, right? You can all get a mental image of a chair. You can all get a mental image of a car. Can you get a mental image of a general piece of furniture that is neutral between chairs and tables and beds and lamps? You can't do it. Okay? Can you get a mental image that is neutral between cars and boats and planes and motorcycles and bicycles and all kinds of vehicles? Can't do it. The highest level at which you can get a mental image is that middle level. Okay? And not only that, there are motor programs. You are now using your motor program for sitting in a chair. If you're driving a car, you have motor programs for driving a car. Okay? You don't have general motor programs for interacting with generalized pieces of furniture. You have different ones for chairs, tables, beds, lamps, and so on. Okay? So there's a level at which you have mental images and you perceive things by Gestalt perception at this middle level called the basic level, and it's the level at which children first learn concepts. Why should you have, what do motor programs have to do with Gestalt perception and mental images? The answer is mirror neurons, which link actions, motor actions, to what you can see and what you can imagine. Mirror neurons explain why there should be this phenomenon. Right? Very profound result of that shows that there's something about the nature of categories themselves that has to do with the neural system. Now, another thing has to do with verb roots. If you go to various languages, you'll have different endings, like you say something like, I ate, he ate, he is eating, he eats, things like that. But the word eat is the same. And they might vary a little, is like run and ran and things like that. But in general, the root of that, run and runs, is run, the same. Why should, now if you think about it, in one case, if I say I'm doing it, I'm running, that's about my action. If I say he's running, it's about my perception of him or my imagination of him. It's not about my action. Why should you have the same verb forms for action and perception? Mirror neurons. The same neurons are firing. There's a reason why language is structured that way. Let's take some more. We have this action. Now this is really wild. Martha Farah at the University of Pennsylvania in 1990 made a remarkable discovery. When you think about it, it's not so remarkable, but it had to happen. What she found was that when you imagined seeing something, let's say she was doing mental imagery experiments, you would remember pictures, and we would ask you to memorize a picture and then imagine it in your brain. And then she did fMRI studies, brain scans, and found that exactly the same parts of the brain were active when you were actually seeing as when you were imagining seeing. And then it was discovered that the same is true for moving. The same part of the brain is active when you imagine kicking a ball and you actually kick. Or when you imagine biting or when you actually bite. And this is not only true for imagining and seeing, it's also true for dreaming and remembering and the use of language. There's the same part, some of the same parts of the brain are used when you either imagine, remember, dream of doing something and you actually do it. And we'll talk in a little bit about why that's true. But it's a remarkable fact that this is the case. And this allows us to get a theory of meaning. What it says is that, let's suppose I give you a sentence like, Harry drank a glass of water. If you can't even imagine what it means to drink a glass of water, then you don't understand the sentence. What that says is that meaning is a form, and understanding involves mental simulation. That is the use of that same part of the brain that you would have for doing it. That's remarkable, but it's an interesting theory of meaning, and that is the basis of the neural theory of meaning and the neural theory of language. And it's crucial for that. And it's profound in many ways, which we'll see shortly. So, one of the ways in which you study this, how do you go about studying something like this? Well, what Jerry Feldman figured out was the following. That there's a level of organization in the brain called a neuronal group, or a cluster of neurons. For example, when I was going through the data for the monkeys, what the monkeys were doing when they were peeling bananas and so on in the experiments at Parma, Vittorio Gallese visited us at Berkeley and we went through all the basic data. We could actually see that there were certain clusters of neurons that were actually used in all of these cases. It's not just one neuron that's used for peeling a banana. It's anywhere between a few dozen and a few hundred. And they could study these neuron by neuron, and you can see how many there are for different actions. But it turns out that these clusters overlap. So, for example, they studied what the monkeys were doing when they were trained to either eat a peanut, or when they were trained to have a cup over here and put the peanut in the cup. So in the one condition, you would eat the peanut, you would put it in the cup. They notice the actions overlap, and the neurons that are firing overlap in the same cluster. That is, neurons in the same cluster could do different things. The same neuron could be doing something different in a different situation, but it takes a number of neurons, between a few dozen and a few hundred, to carry out any action. Okay? What that suggests is the following kind of theory. That you have what are called functional circuitry, and that the neurons used to carry out a particular action are what are called a node. That's a cluster of neurons that carry out the action, and nodes can overlap. But then the question is, at the level of the node, are there generalizations you can see in the circuitry? And the answer is yes. And that's where we're going. That's where the current theory has led. So we're going to talk about nodes, functional subjects, and functional circuitry. Now, to get there, we need to talk about some brain structure that is quite remarkable. What are called topographic maps. And these are neural structures that preserve closeness. And let me try to give you some examples of this. In the primary visual cortex, back here, you have lots of neural connections coming from your retina, going through the LGN to the opposite side of the brain, both sides. And each neuron coming out of the retina corresponds to a neuron, a single corresponding neuron here. And the one right next to it is right next to it here. Not necessarily in the same orientation, but right next to it. They preserve closeness. This is not a miracle. How does it happen? And not only that, they can see, neuroscientists have looked at cat embryos and can see the development and can see the axons coming from the eye, going through here, looking for the right spot to land back here. And they try here, and then they land in a certain place. And when they wind up, they preserve closeness. How does this happen? It happens because coming out of the eye, there is a chemical gradient that has to do with two perpendicular places where the chemicals are extruded, and the closer they are to the place they're extruded, the thicker they are. And so there's a degree of thickness at every point. So every axon coming out of here going to there gets attached to a pair of chemicals with a certain degree of thickness, a certain amount of chemicals. And the corresponding chemicals that bind to those chemicals are extruded over here. And they have to fit exactly in order for them to land and bind. It's not a miracle, it's chemistry. Right? That is how it's possible to have a topographic map. And that it would preserve closeness. That is, the maps here preserves closeness in the retina. Now, you get them also in the auditory cortex, because neurons coming from the inner ear that go around there, the inner ear is like a big horn, and there are hairs along there, neurons connected to that, and liquid inside that vibrates when you hear something. And you have different frequencies along the inner ear that make the hair vibrate either a lot, and also the various waves going through there give you frequencies at different locations there. Those neurons are connected to the cortex, called the auditory cortex, and that preserves closeness of frequency and closeness of intensity. So that the auditory cortex is a map of frequency and intensity in what you hear. Okay? Pretty wild. Okay? That's those, and we have maps not just in our brains for lots of these things. We have maps that preserve frequency, spatial location, movement, speed, all sorts of things like that are preserving input. And they're all through our brain, through our cortex. You have ridges where there might be 7 maps, one right after another, of the visual field. Mike Silver in his lab at Berkeley studies what happens in visual maps. And you can see when you flash a light that moves and you say attend to this light, in those maps you can actually see the activation of the neurons going across the maps, but they're in different locations in different maps, and they're still trying to figure out what the different maps are doing. But they can find the maps there. Moreover, they're throughout your body. So what is called phantom limb syndrome, if you lose part of an arm, you can feel pain in a limb that isn't there. Why? Because there's a map of the hand that you were born with that comes down here, and when you lose it, in that map, it preserves closeness of the neural connections in your fingers. That's how phantom limb syndrome works. Okay? We have maps throughout our brain and our body all over the place. Now, that is crucial for understanding how meaning works. Okay? So now, within each map, there are connections in the neurons in the map and connections across maps. Both happen. Okay? And there are certain functional types that occur that link across maps. So let me tell you about some of these circuit types, because these circuit types, there are 4 types, these circuit types we think are all that you need to characterize conceptual thought in the right places. And that's, we don't know if this is true, this is a hypothesis. And the hypothesis goes like this. If you think about a frame, like, for, let's say, the hospital frame with doctors and nurses and so on, there's certain semantic roles. And each of these semantic roles, like doctor and nurse, evokes the entire frame. And the hospital frame evokes each of those, activates those. The entire hospital frame is what we call a Gestalt. The circuit needing to do that, if that whole thing is active, let's call that a Gestalt node, and the others semantic role nodes. If the Gestalt node is active for the hospital, then all of the others are active. You can think of doctors, nurses, and so on. If you talk about surgery, then you're in the hospital. It activates the hospital node, and so on. That is, each of the roles activates the other. That creates a Gestalt of a hospital. It's a structure, and other things aren't in there. So you talk about a hospital, and a pine tree or a desert is not in the hospital. It's not part of the hospital frame. It's not there. There's a Gestalt for that. And for every other structure that you understand, you have that. That is what a Gestalt circuit does. And then we'll see that it does other things too. But what it does is bind things together to form whole Gestalts out of particular roles. There's a binding circuit. Now, to understand a binding circuit, take a simple example. The example is the word into versus the words in and the word to. Okay? In has a container schema. It has an interior, a boundary, and exterior. In basically, you are having three maps which are tied together, one activating the interior, one activating the boundary, one activating the exterior, and they're tied together as a single collection. Now, that is in a different part of the brain than the map that characterizes a source, a path, and a goal of motion. So there's a map that says, oh, here's where you started, here's all the places you've been, we're going to activate those neurons, and here's where you wind up, that's the goal. Okay? And those are in two different parts of the brain, in two different maps. There's a third map where these are brought together. The into map says that the goal is in the interior. Well, how does the goal get in there? It can't move. Nothing in the brain moves from one place to another. You have to have neural connections between these two maps and a third map. And in the third map, the goal maps to a certain point, and the interior activates that point. And if you get enough activation from both of these to make the neuron here fire, then that says you have an into. And this third map is going to fit your image of the world. It's going to fit your visual understanding of it or your imagination. So if you can imagine pouring water into a glass, there's a path of the water from a pitcher into the glass, and the structure of the glass as a container is in one place, this path of the water is in another place, and there's a map that says they're coming together right here. That's the only way you can understand into. And then there's a word into that says, hey, you activate that. Now, that is how it's possible for a brain, a physical thing, to have a concept like into, which involves two different structures. As simple as that is. But that is how that is going to work. Okay, now, one of the things these circuits do is they form these schemas, frames, and complex concepts. And let's talk a little bit about a complex concept. Take the concept of a restaurant. What do you know about a restaurant? Well, actually, there's a frame for a restaurant. You know that there are menus, there's a maitre d', there's a chef, there's a dish, you eat, there's a customer, etc. But a restaurant is actually made up of three other frames. There's a business frame. This is a business. There is a cooking and eating, a food service frame. Somebody cooks and serves you food. And there's a host-guest frame. So the maitre d' is the host. The customer is a guest, and the customer is also the person who is fed. And there's a chef, and the chef is the cook who feeds the customer, etc. You are binding together three frames, and you've got a third frame for a restaurant, and these things bind together from each of these frames to the third one. That's how complex frames get made up in a brain. You take physical structures and you have binding circuits and you bind them together in other frames. Okay? This is physical, and that's how it works. Now, what about learning? One of the things that's remarkable is this. When you are born, you're born with about 100 billion neurons. That's a lot. Well, each of them has about 1,000 to 10,000 inputs and outputs. That gives you trillions of connections all over your brain when you're born. By the time you are 5, half of them have died. Half of the connections have died. The ones that are least used have died off. If you don't hear music till the time you are 5, you'll not become a musician. Won't happen. If you don't learn fine motor control in that point, from the time you're 5, you'll never become a pianist. You'll never become a seamstress or of doing anything that requires fine motor control, and so on. That's why early childhood education is so crucial. So crucial. Now, these still trillions of connections are there. Even though half of them die off, you still have trillions left. And they're around, and some of them actually have to do with the concepts you've learned. But what does it mean to learn a concept? It means you've learned a neural circuitry, a complex circuit. How do you learn a complex circuit? By strengthening the synapses connecting the neurons. That is, in a circuit, all of the synapses in the circuit have to be strengthened. And how do they get strengthened? They get strengthened in a couple of ways that we'll talk about, but they have to be firing in order to get strengthened. So anything that's not firing is not going to be strengthened, and it turns out that at any point in your life, you still have trillions of connections waiting to form circuitry, where the synapses have not yet gotten strengthened enough to form a circuit. And anything you learn has to do with strengthening synapses linking to previous circuits. In short, when you learn something, it's on the basis of what you learned before. It's the minimal connections needed to form new circuitry, to learn that thing. And learning happens all the time. Now, sometimes you get new neurons formed, not too often. There are very small parts of the brain where new neurons are produced. But you can learn things all your life in this way. You can keep learning, whatever your age is, provided, this hasn't started to die off. Now, what kinds of neural learning are there? There are three basic kinds, at least. And it's going to be important to understand what they are for reasons you'll see in a minute. One, there's what's called Hebbian learning. Okay, what does that mean? It means neurons that fire together wire together. That is, you have two neurons that are connected next to each other and they're firing at the same time. They're going to learn gradually, very slowly, strengthen the synapses connecting them. Okay, that's called Hebbian learning. There's what's called long-term potentiation and long-term depression. That is, in very emotional situations, what happens? If you're really happy, dopamine gets flooded out there. If you're sad, other neurotransmitters and hormones flood parts of your brain. Okay? What happens then is that those neurotransmitters either increase greatly right away the connections, the connection strengths immediately to form a new circuit, or they inhibit it. They stop it from forming a new circuit. They can depress it or activate it. And long-term potentiation happens in trauma. In trauma, you learn things you don't forget very easily. Think of 9/11. Right? You're not going to forget that. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination, you can probably remember exactly where you were. Other traumas, as clinical psychologists have pointed out and Freud observed, affect you the rest of your life because of long-term potentiation. That is, you have these things there. The third kind is recently discovered, and it's really wild and very important. What's called time-dependent plasticity. And you'll see in a minute why this is important. Way down, when you have two neurons that are connected to each other, here you have two neurons, the axon from one goes to here, the axon from the other goes to there. They're connected to each other, okay? And they impinge on each other. Now, it turns out that when one of them fires first, strongly, it increases the strength of the connection in its direction and decreases the strength in the other direction. Okay? This is just little neurons connected to each other. Okay, so what? It turns out that determines the directionality of actions and the ability to do that, and it determines the structure of metaphor. How can something like that determine metaphor? Well, let's look. Okay? A conceptual metaphor is a mapping from frame to frame across different brain regions, as in love is a journey, for example, between journeys and love. Okay, and they can be complex, or they can be made up of smaller metaphors. For example, intimacy is closeness, or achieving a purpose is reaching a destination. Okay? These are very basic, simple metaphors. More is up, less is down. Happy is oriented up, sad is oriented down. Very simple metaphors. Those metaphors are called primary metaphors, and they are learned usually before language just by living in the world. Well, how does that work? How is it possible? And also, why is it that more is up, not up is more? Affection is warmth. Why isn't warmth affection? Why is it, how do you know that when you talk about a warm person, you mean someone affectionate, but it's not the case if you're talking about temperature, you talk about affection, right? It doesn't work in the opposite direction. How do you learn it at all, first? And that's crucial. You learn it when experiences come together. Think for a minute about learning more is up. You pour more water in the glass, the level goes up every time. You pile more stuff on your desk, the level goes up. There's a correlation in the world, in your experience, between quantity and verticality. Or think of affection as warmth. You're held affectionately by your parents as a child, you experience affection, and you feel the temperature. Now, what's interesting about this is that quantity and verticality are registered in the brain in different places. Affection and warmth are registered in the brain in different places. So how do you get a metaphor out of that? The answer to that is interesting. What happens is, when you, let's take affection and warmth. You feel affection in emotional regions, you feel warmth in temperature. You have firing in both places at once. And every time you're held affectionately, you fire again. Or let's take more is up. You experience verticality in one part of your brain, quantity in another. Every time you see water poured into a glass, the child may not even notice it consciously, but the brain notices it. It will notice the level going up, and it will notice there's more quantity, and two parts of the brain will fire simultaneously. But what happens when that happens over and over again? Two places fire, you get strengthening. But because they're connected, each neuron to 1,000 to 10,000 others, you get spreading activation to along existing pathways. So it spreads, and that gets stronger. And it spreads further, and that gets stronger. And sooner or later, the shortest pathway between these two parts of the brain is found. When that shortest pathway is found, you get a circuit formed. And it's formed via Hebbian learning. But when you reach the other sides, what happens? What's interesting is that the one that fires first is going to get strengthened in one direction and become the source domain, and the one that doesn't fire first will be weakened and become the target domain. So why is it more is up, not up is more? The reason is that your brain is always computing verticality. Even when you're asleep, parts of your brain are computing what's up, where the gravitational field is. Okay? But not always computing quantity. Your brain is always computing temperature, but not always computing affection. So that its affection is warmth, not warmth is affection. This works for the hundreds of cases of primary metaphor we have studied. Hundreds of cases work like this, and they work by time-dependent plasticity at the level of individual neural pairings. Something that low can determine the entire metaphorical structure that structures how you understand the world metaphorically. That's amazing. I never knew when I started doing this stuff. I've been now working on it for, I won't tell you how many years, 50 actually. I never imagined that that could be true, and yet it is. It's a remarkable, remarkable fact. Now, That's how primary metaphors work, just as I described it. And we have very interesting experimental evidence that's been done in a new field. The field is called embodied cognition. And what an embodied cognition does is do experiments that show that the metaphorical structure in your brain that's fixed there, linking two parts of the brain, allowing you to reason about one in terms of the other, determines behavior, determines what you do. Okay? So, for example, at the University of Amsterdam, there was a study which showed that subjects who were thinking about the future, they said, okay guys, think about something in the future. And then they took cameras very carefully and noticed if they were thinking about the future, they leaned forward, and if they were thinking about the past, they leaned backwards. A little bit, but they leaned. You could measure it. The future is ahead, the past is behind. Let's look ahead to the future, let's put it all behind us. That metaphor structure is a physical structure in the brain that will determine, when you're thinking about the future, that you lean forward a little bit, and about the past, that you lean backward a little bit. Think about how wild that is. That this metaphorical structure is not just about thought and reasoning, it's not just about language, it determines how you live in the world, how you function. At Yale, researchers brought in subjects, and they said, and they gave half of them warm coffee. It was winter in Yale. They gave them half of them warm coffee and half of them cold coffee. And then they asked them, okay, now the experiment starts. That was supposed to be before the experiment. Now the experiment starts. The experiment is, imagine you've just met somebody and describe the person you met. On the whole, statistically, the ones who got the warm coffee described someone who is nice to them, a friendly person, and the ones who got the cold coffee described an unfriendly person. Affection is warmth. Right? Behavior is being determined there. Let's take some more. At Toronto, subjects were asked to remember a time when they're either socially accepted or socially snubbed. Those with the warm memories of acceptance judged the room. They were asked, how warm is the room? They judged the room to be 5 degrees warmer than the people who remember being snubbed. Right? Affection is warmth. Right? Affecting how you determine and how you judge the temperature in a room. Okay? There are subjects who are asked to think about a moral transgression, like adultery or cheating on a test. And then at the end, as they left, they said, oh, we have a gift for you. You can choose one of two things. You can get either an antiseptic cloth or a pencil. Right? The ones who thought about immoral things got the antiseptic cloth. Right? Another example of this, a similar one, was subjects were brought in, and half of them were told to whisper in the ear, they're in a group, whisper in other people's ears and say something nasty about somebody else. The other guys were told to say something nice about somebody else. Okay? On the way out, they had a chance to either wash their hands or not. Guess who washed their hands? The people who said immoral things, right? Immorality is purity, right? We find this over and over. There are now hundreds of these experiments. I'll give you another example. Daniel Casasanto has a very nice experimental apparatus. It's 3 pieces of wood with a groove in each, and he has marbles in the center one. And he asks subjects to move the marbles either up for some subjects or to move it down for other subjects. And then he has these guys moving these marbles up, and he says, as you move the marbles up or down, whichever it is, tell me a story. The guys who move the marbles up tell happy stories. The guys who move the marbles down tell sad stories. Happy is up, sad is down, right? Because of your physiology. This is going on all the time. The experiments keep coming out, day after day, almost. That's called embodied cognition. And it works because the metaphors are physically there in your brain, structuring your behavior. Not just your understanding, not just your language, but what you do. Let me give you another example. There's a group in Germany where they tell people, okay, pick a number. Don't tell me. Tell me later, but just pick a number. Okay? Now pick another number. Now what they do is they measure eye movements. And what they found was that when the eyes go up and to the right, they're picking a number higher than the first number. And when they go down and to the left, they're picking a number lower. Why? More is up, less is down. And why left and right? Think of speedometers or the number line. You do it left to right. That is, the lower numbers are on the left, the higher numbers are on the right. Right? Those metaphors are structuring how you think about these things, how you think about numbers. Right? And the experiments go on and on. But the point is, that behavior makes sense. And it makes sense because the metaphors are physically there in your brain, structuring what you do. So, we've now looked at these. There are various kinds of circuits. I won't go through all of this stuff. One of the things that my colleague Srini Narayanan does, he's the guy who figured out how this primary metaphors work and how they were learned originally. He does neural computation, and what he does is he takes these neural cell clusters, they correspond to nodes over here, and the nodes are understood in certain ways, and the dendrites are input links and so on. And what he does is he takes a computational structure, let's go back to that. He takes this kind of physical structure, which is the actual physical neuron by neuron things, looks at them in terms of nodes, which is functional clusters, and then there's a form of computation that he uses that has input links and output links in certain places and so on. They're called Petri nets, and he models how the neural system works in terms of these computational networks. And the modeling is very accurate. That is, he can tweak it in such a way that it does what the brain is doing. He can do neural modeling that is based on these correlations. That's how you do neural modeling. And again, the basic functional circuits are Gestalt circuits, binding circuits, and then what I've called gated activations and inhibitions. But the idea here is, just as we've seen, these basic simple circuits allow you to connect things. So let me talk a little bit about gated activations. What does that mean? Right? Think about a metaphor. When you're learning a structure, you have a frame, which is a hierarchical structure, and you're activating another structure someplace else. You're mapping from node to node, which means you have to have activating connections going from here to here. But they have to fit together as one thing, right? And that one thing has a Gestalt circuit that says these all fit together, they're all one metaphor. And they gate, that is, when the Gestalt circuit is on, when you know that this is a metaphor, this allows the activation to go through. If it's not a metaphor, if this is literal, it's off, it doesn't allow the activation to go through. Very, very simple structure. That's the kind of ways that these things fit together, and I could go through this for all the kinds of things that are involved in cognition, but that's the sort of modeling that gets done. If you have, I won't go through all this, if you have a frame, the schema name for the whole thing is a control node and a Gestalt circuit, etc. I'm not going to go through all that, but technically what you can do is take the structure of a frame or a schema and then show that every part of the linguistic description of it can map one-to-one onto a circuit of a certain kind, and that can map onto a neurocomputational mechanism that tells you what the circuit does. That's what this research is about. That's what we sit around doing at the Neural Theory of Language project at Berkeley. And this is pretty cool. It's fun. Now, the big deal has to do with the difference between what is called modularity and what is called cascades. And this matters. There's an old view of fMRIs and the brain, these brain scan pictures that you see, that says the following. let's suppose that there's some task that you're studying, and you have somebody doing this task, and whenever they do this task, a certain part of the brain lights up a lot. It activates a lot, and you see a lot of activation. You don't know what's going on, but there's a whole lot of oxygen being put into the neurons. And then suppose you have a patient who has a lesion in that spot, and they can't do the task. So the old idea was saying, the task is done there. Language works in this part of the brain. This emotion is in that part of the brain. Judgment is in this part of the brain. And you see this discussed a lot in the popular literature and sometimes even in the scientific journals. That's the old view. What has been found out is that that's not true. Rather, what's involved is many parts of the brain, and what's in that particular place is where the activation is going through. And if there's a lesion there, it doesn't go through to the rest of the brain. But it has to go through to lots of parts of the brain to get meaning. And that's what's cool. So the old view is what's called modularity. So, for example, in language, you'll hear people saying there is a language organ or a language module, and all language is done there. Language is done all over the brain because language is very complicated and does all kinds of different things. There is no such thing as a module where there is language in one little place. Lots of different things are done all over, linking these things together in what are called cascades. So let me tell you and give you some feel for what a cascade is. And this is important. Cascades link, they're circuits that link across maps, and they either form gestalts or bindings across maps or activations across maps. Now, we've talked about into. That's one example of that, where you have a map for motion and a map for containment, and then they map together to form a cascade linking motion and containment. And then if I say he put the ring into the drawer, then you have put has to do with a force that applies to the ring that moves it into the drawer, and you have to put together your understanding of application of force to your understanding of motion to an interior thing, and they have to bind together to one complex meaning in a cascade. Okay? Now, so binding circuits link entities in two different maps to a single entity in a third map. Now, cascades are interesting. And so let's take an example from Stanislas Dehaene, a great neuroscientist in Paris, who has a great book. I recommend it highly, and it's very readable, called Reading in the Brain. It's a book about reading. And if you want to find out how neuroscientists think, this is a great book to read. Here's how it works. In the visual cortex, you get inputs from the retina here. You get neurons coming in there. They're linked immediately. Now, in there, those are connected to another layer. So they come here, they're connected to another layer. And these ones in the second ones compute what is called a center surround structure. What does that mean? It means neurons in the second layer that are in the center, in the second layer, that what that says, that those second layer neurons light up best when they see, let's say, a black dot with a white surround, or a white dot with a black surround, or a red dot with a green surround, etc. A center and a surround. How does that work? It means they get activation from the black dot coming in and inhibition from the white surround out there. And that says if you get lots of black there with a weaker inhibition around it, you're going to get activation of that black dot, and it'll fire best when you see a dot with a white surround. Okay, so far so good. But now those things move to the next layer. In the next layer, they form lines. How do you form a line? You have overlapping centers. So you have overlapping centers in a certain direction, you're going to form a little line. How do you form that line? Well, in the third layer, you're going to have a single, let's say a single neuron, which will get input from all of those centers in the center surround thing. And that will light up if you have that oriented in a certain way. And then it turns out that there are these columns in the brain where you have 16 types of orientations, and depending on how these are linked up. So when you see little line segments, that's how you see them. If they're longer lines, then there's another layer where the lines are connected one after another. Now, when you have these things together, how do you see the letter E? How is it possible to see the letter E? Well, it turns out that there's a part of the brain over here called what is called the letter box. What that means is in the part that's closest to the back, whenever you read a letter, something will be activated there. And they can see those activations and so on. Well, how does that work? Well, if you have these lines, there's another layer in between where the lines come together to form combinations of lines, like in the letter E, where there's one line here hitting this and another line coming out. Those are called geons. They are parts of the structures of perceived objects. So if you see an object, that's how you fit it together, by fitting these lines together. And they are fitted together by looking at the parts that intersect are connected to a single neuron in the next layer. Okay? Then when you put the geons together, you get the letter E. Okay? To get the letter E, you have to have the entire cascade activated, but at each point it's simple. Simple connections all the way down. Because the letter E requires that you see every dot, every line, every connection of lines, and the way the lines fit together. And that's just the letter E. Right? But that's what a cascade is. It's like what's happening with into or with other things. And let me give you a more complicated example. Suppose you have a commercial event, like buying or selling or something. Every commercial event has certain roles. It has a buyer, a seller, goods and money, an action of buying, an action of selling, and so on. Each of those have that. But every commercial event is an exchange. All right? So you need to know that if there's a commercial event, you have another layer in which there's an exchange. Well, what's an exchange? An exchange is a mutual transfer. Well, a mutual transfer says there's a transfer going from here to here and a transfer going from here to here, and the transferer here is the transferee there, and there's a binding in another layer, the exchange layer, where these things fit together in a certain way. So there's a binding to the exchange layer from the two transfer layers. Well, what's a transfer? Well, transfer in an exchange has to do with the transfer of possessions. So you have to know that the things transferred are fitting into a possession layer somewhere. Well, what's a possession? Well, physically, a possession has two parts. Has something you have access to physically and something you control. So there has to be a layer for access and a layer for control, and they have to fit together. Okay, so then you have a transfer. Well, what is a transfer? Physically, a transfer is physically moving something, applying force to it, so that there's a motion from one place to another. So you have to have a part where you apply the force and a part where there's movement, and they have to be bound together in the transfer layer. Okay? All of that is known when you say, I bought a book for $10. Everything, all of it is lit up. Everything is activated, the entire cascade. And it comes down to physical things. But then, metaphors can apply to that. If I try to tell you this story and you say, I don't buy that, you're understanding it metaphorically. Or you can, sell people property. You can sell people ideas. You can have, you can patent an idea and then sell it. Or copyright something and sell it abstractly. That is, there are metaphorical concepts that take this and take it further. To understand those, you have to understand the entire cascade down to the connections to the body. And that's what it means for meaning to be embodied. Now, okay, so we have lots of those. Commercial event, blah, blah, blah. Now, every word, what about language? Every word is defined in terms of a frame. What does that mean? It means if you have a word which is sounds, a sequence of sounds, and you have a meaning, let's say the meaning is buying, to buy, a verb like buy, which has to do with this entire cascade over here, there has to be a link. Well, what kind of link is it? Well, it's got to go in both directions. That is, the concept of buying, if you want to say it, is you're going to have the idea and you're going to say the word buy. You hear the word buy, it's got to go the other way. What you need is a Gestalt circuit where either one activates the Gestalt node which activates the rest. So the Gestalt circuit, which structures frames in the right place, linking the part of the language that has to do with phonology over here with the rest of the brain over there, that has to be in a Gestalt circuit, which links words to their meanings. Very, very important. But how does grammar work? What is a noun? Well, a noun is a name of a person, place, or thing, either a literal one or a metaphorical one. That is, it's a name of an entity. Well, what's a name? A name is something in the phonology which is linked to some entity, and is an entity frame, an entity schema that has, every entity has a certain kind of structure, which I won't go into here, but we know a lot about that structure. Every entity has a certain structure, and what you're doing is linking a single phonological entity over here to a conceptual entity over there via a Gestalt node. That Gestalt node is a noun. The category noun is what links these two. So grammatical categories are in the Gestalt nodes that do the linking between the phonology and the meaning. That's part of the neural theory of language that we've been developing. Now, that's the idea in general. And what you have in grammar is hierarchical structure that comes from the semantics and conceptual Gestalt nodes, and linear structure that comes from speaking. And when you're putting the hierarchical structure and the linear structure together via these Gestalt nodes that link it, you get grammar. That is our theory of how this works, and what we're trying to do now is work out the complete details, and that's a long job. And we have some of it done and lots of it not done. But that's where this is going, and that's what this is all about. So then the question is, why bother? Right? One, it's cool, it's beautiful, all right? You can answer the question, how is it possible to get meaning and language out of neurons? Right? You can begin to see that there's really an answer to this question, and it has to do with all this stuff. That's amazing that this could possibly happen. With all of these people contributing all of these pieces to this, really incredible thing is happening. But it turns out that it matters in our lives. It matters in our politics. As I've been writing, there's a book outside you can pick up called The Political Mind. It's the 5th book in a series of how these things apply to politics. It matters for a number of reasons. Conservatives and progressives have different ways of understanding the world via different metaphorical systems. And this is a crucial thing. They both understand, think for a minute of when you are first governed. You're first governed in your family by your parents. So you learn that a governing institution is a family, and it could be a religion or a classroom or a team or a nation. But the governing, or the market, a governing institution is a family. Well, what kind of family is it? Well, there are different moral systems governing morality and that govern types of families. And that has to do with well-being as a child. As a child, you learn certain conditions of well-being that lead to metaphors for morality via the mechanisms we've just seen. So how do you get metaphors for morality? And morality turns out to all be based on a set of about 24 metaphors. And if you want to see what they are, they're in a book outside called Philosophy in the Flesh, chapter 14. Now, and they're summarized in the shorter book. Okay? Now, the thing about it is this. Right? I'll just tell you briefly, and then we'll go to Q&A. Well, let's go to Q&A, you can ask. Okay? Because I'm going to be done. Thanks. Okay? So, there are 3 microphones out there, and by all means.
The guy upstairs, go ahead.
Yes.
Lakoff.
Hi.
Thank you. Yesterday morning I was in Berkeley and drove home, 12 hours in the car, gave me a chance to experience, I think, what you were talking about. My wife and I are always turn north, what? Left, right, that kind of thing. Does that mean she never looked at a map before she was 5? How does that perception come across? And also I was thinking some of what you were talking about is somewhat judgmental in terms of the coffee, for instance. In some societies, coffee is considered a drug that has a rather negative connotation versus others. In Seattle, it's entirely different. So would that affect the results of your study when someone was given coffee, regardless of whether it was cold or warm, whether they felt it was a positive thing or a negative thing?
Well, luckily this was at Yale, where it was all positive. there were students involved, and every student has the positive version of it. It could very well be that if you looked at a certain culture where, if you did this study in Utah, for example, it might come out very differently.
Over here?
Yes.
I was wondering more about the writing. You say our brain, input, for an E, looks at the lines and how it all connects. What about handwriting? Because, that's very different than type. How does it process it in the same way?
Well, what's going on there is you have a connection between how you're moving your hand and a mental image of that connected via the mirror neuron structures. So what you're doing is trying to reproduce a certain structure, and cursive writing is not the same as other things. They have curves, but there are geons for curves as well. And the question then is, how do you link those up? So how do you link up a cursive A with a printed A, or a little a with a capital A? What makes them all A? And the answer to that is a Gestalt circuit. That is, if you have each of those as a different role, a cursive A, a printed A, a capital A, etc., and a Gestalt circuit says these are all one thing. But it's interesting about it is that Gestalt circuit does that work there, whereas in another part of the brain it creates a frame. In another part of the brain it links form and meaning. The same circuitry can do different jobs in different parts of the brain. Thank you.
Question over here?
Yes.
Hello, Professor. Perhaps this will give you the door to walk through into that last piece you were just not quite able to finish. But going back to very early in what you said in terms of the ability to imagine creating the ability to act, okay? Does the lack of action toward peace in the Middle East simply mean the lack of ability on the part of the protagonists to imagine peace in the Middle East?
Probably yes, sadly.
And then about the learning, how does that change?
Okay, it changes via the ability to form empathy, to imagine what it is to be in someone else's shoes. And that's a deep thing. That is mirror neuron stuff, but it is a fundamental ability that we all have. And the question is, how do you generate empathy with other people? One is by actually meeting other people. When you have Palestinians and Israelis who actually live in the same village and are friends, They like each other just as any other two people would like each other. They're human beings. They may help each other and care about each other and be in each other's lives. And this is the sort of thing that you need to do across national lines and across religious lines and so on. One of the great things that Barack Obama did in his campaign, unfortunately he didn't do it in administering, but in his campaign he said some really deep things. The first thing he kept saying over and over is that the most important thing his mother taught him was empathy. To think about being in someone else's shoes, to understand it, to feel it, right? That was one of the most important things in life. And then he pointed out that democracy is based on empathy. The reason that we have principles like fairness and equality for everybody, not just for the powerful, is that we care about other people. That's what it means to have a democracy that functions. That democracy is inherently caring about other people and taking the responsibility to act on that care. And to make yourself as good as possible, to work hard at doing it. Both at the level of the family, at the level of the community, and the level of the nation. And something that he repeated over and over. If you want the most beautiful discussion of it, it's in his Father's Day speech in 2008. But he repeated it again on April 13th of this year, a speech which very few people heard because it was like 10:30 in the morning on the West Coast. But if you go to whitehouse.gov and look up his April 13th speech, he repeats it again and he explains how his approach to the budget and the deficit, etc., comes out of an understanding of democracy in those terms. It's a beautiful, beautiful account of what it means to think about how you spend your money, that budgets are moral documents that have to do with the country, and you don't give up the ideals of the country when you're making up a budget.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Are there patterns in cascade orientation to signify a difference between concept and percept?
You can tell the difference. The answer is that it's not there. It's actually in a connection to the prefrontal cortex. There's an experiment done at UCLA, a set of experiments done by a professor who does brain operations on split brain patients, and they've located neurons that increase their firing when you perform an action and decrease their firing when the same action is performed by somebody else. That is, the mirror neurons, when you look at the actual mirror neuron data that came out of Parma, which I did with Galese, what you find is that the degree of activation is more when you're doing it than when you're seeing it. And this difference is exacerbated by these neurons in the prefrontal cortex, and that's a part of the cortex that has to do with judgment. And so it's important to judge whether something is happening to you or somebody else, and of course you have the ability to do that. Yes.
Regarding the frames you were talking about, how can one learn the frame, for example, the hospital as we are using, if that person would grow up on the deserted island with no hospitals, no healthcare, nothing? Can we deconstruct that frame to some basic building blocks, axioms like that? And how we learn those axioms? Are we learning them from the beginning at what point of our life? Are they genetically based, or they're starting to learn once the first neurons start to fire?
Okay, very, very important question. Let's reduce it first to a simple case. Imagine a flying pig. Right? Now, pigs don't fly, but you can imagine a flying pig. It's called Pegasus, all right. What is Pegasus like? Pegasus is a pig, and pig has wings. Where the wings are attached, they're attached to the side. Where is the snout going? It's going forward. Okay. But there are two kinds of flying pigs. There's Pegasus and super swine. Super swine is like Mighty Mouse. He's Superman. He goes like this and has a cape, but it's a pig. Now, what you can do is put together things from your imagination, parts that are a man like Superman and a pig, and do a neural binding from two different maps onto a third map. That allows for imagination for putting ideas together, which is how you put together transfers and exchanges to get the notion of buying, for example. Now, somebody born on a deserted island may not be able to understand what a defibrillator is. They may not ever be able to get enough stuff to do it, but they may for the following reason. That is, if you break down the concepts into parts, you have an illness. There's something that makes you feel bad, that decreases your sense of well-being, which has to do with the emotional regions, where you have a decrease in senses of well-being, or you have pain. There are certain kinds of things that take pain away or allow you to increase your well-being. There are people who may know about how to do that, often called shamans, in that thing. Okay? They're like primitive doctors. Right? Then you can generalize that to other kinds of things and extend it in that way. But it depends upon the ability to understand well-being and pain versus and things that take that pain away, that are causal. So you understand pain as something you have, and causal is something that removes it via a metaphor. And then there's a person who exerts some force or who does some action that does that. So causal action is understood as exerting forces. Those metaphors are universal, and they're used to patch these things together into basic ideas of what a shaman does. Then that can go further as you learn more and more stuff in Western medicine and so on. But that's basically how these things get built up.
Okay, thank you. We got to run.
Okay, thanks. Great. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.